So recently we've had a series of conversations that go back and forth, and I remember one or both of us always saying, oh, that sounds like a great topic for a podcast. So here's our opportunity, I guess. Welcome to the Labio experiment. I'm your host, Sam Taggart from SAS Workshops. If you're a developer looking to unlock your potential and take your skills to the next level, then look no further. From freeing your imagination and experimenting with new ideas and workflows, to exploring aspects of software development you've never even considered before, I'm going to help you grow your craft so you can approach your work like an artist and have more fun with what you do. In my 15 years working with and training developers, I've helped dozens of individuals and organizations embrace a growth and learning mindset that allows us to overcome challenges and embrace failure as the essential learning experience it is. If you're ready for the philosophies, strategies, tips, and tricks that will unlock your creativity, then it's time to get to work.
This episode of the Labio Experiment podcast was recorded on site. Please excuse any bumps, bangs, clangs, or crashes that you may hear during the episode.
So I am here with Jörg Hampel at GDevCon. So first of all, thank you for organizing GDevCon, because I know you're involved in that, you and Steve and a whole bunch of other people. So I appreciate that because I'm doing the GDevCon NA and I know exactly how much work that is. So
yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
You're very welcome. Organizing this one was a bit trickier than the previous ones due to the pandemic and then moving it and canceling and postponing. But we're here at the iMuseum in Amsterdam and it's great. So I think it worked out in the end.
Yeah, I like it. I like the venue. I like Amsterdam. Yeah. Amsterdam's a cool city. So I'm happy to be able to come over here. It's cool. And thank you for taking the time to sit down with me because I'm sure you're also very busy.
Of course.
So you and I have known each other for how long? Probably a couple of years now, right? At least
5 years, maybe?
5 years? Okay. Yeah. So recently we've had a series of conversations that go back and forth. And I remember one or both of us always saying, oh, that sounds like a great topic for a podcast. So here's our opportunity, I guess. A lot of conversations I think have been going on about workflows because we're both in this consulting area of like helping other teams with their workflows. And we have some slightly different opinions, which is cool. That's all right. That's good. But what I want to talk about, I think, is I'd like you to explain. So I know you talk about this idea of inner source, which is taking open source ideas and the workflows from that, and then applying them to interior projects or within your own company. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of curious, like how you arrived at that, and like what made you think this could work for what we're doing, and like what's the rationale behind that?
Yeah. So inner source is a term that was coined by Tim O'Reilly, I think maybe 20 years ago, roughly. So that's when this thing started out, and it is a whole movement these days. So there are consortiums and groups who are actively working towards making inner source a thing. And basically it is, like you said, taking tools, processes, workflows from the open source movement and figuring out how to make them work in a closed environment. The closed environment, I guess, usually is some kind of business environment because that's usually the opposite to open source, right? And then the question is, which of these things that seem to work well for the open source world would be beneficial to an environment or a group that is closed down, but inside its limitations or its boundaries, still they are flexible to, and they want to share code, for example. So if you think about larger corporations, like for example Siemens, they are a proponent in the inner source movement. They have lots of groups, lots of divisions, etc., etc. So it does make sense for them to try and share knowledge, code, processes, whatever within their teams. Mm-hmm. And seeing as those teams are still silos, they kind of see or face the same challenges as the open source world. That you say you have developers who are not really connected to each other, maybe distributed all over the world. And how do you bring those people together?
That's really interesting, actually, because I'd heard you talk about inner source, and my original interpretation was that you were applying it within like Hampelsoft. Like you guys have a lot of stuff that you've open sourced, and you're like, we use the same workflow inside, and that makes a lot of sense, like standardize on a workflow. But I hadn't really thought about companies and large companies and being spread out, because I know when I worked at Westinghouse, there were multiple groups doing Labio development, and none of them talked to each other, none of them knew about each other. And so I could totally see where, like, if one had written a driver for a specific thing, like it's one thing to have the driver and have it sit there and like, okay, yeah, we can get a copy of it and we can install. But if it's open source, like, or inner source, I guess, right? Then it's available on a GitLab or internal GitLab repository or whatever. Then you could have pull requests going back and forth and collaborate a lot better. So that seems really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and it's an uphill battle, I guess, because these silos, they are not maybe or potentially not connected to each other. So the very first thing would be for them to talk to each other, maybe have like some kind of user group meetings or whatever, maybe have a shared drive where they would start like exchanging documents or even source code. And then later on in the journey, you can really think about formalizing and standardizing that and really thinking about, okay, we have this, I don't know, Git server. So how can we give each other access? Who has read or write access? What's the process? How do I even find out about what's available? How do I find out about what are the next upcoming work packages or the features that you would want to see? And all of that is already available in the open source world, right? If you think about GitHub, there are the repositories, you got the issue tracker, you fork the repo to your own machine, you do your changes, you send a merge or pull request. So the technology is there, and why not use it in a not global, but like smaller, closed down community?
Yeah. No, well, I'm wondering if it's not, I don't know. So you say it's difficult to sell, but I'm wondering, like, I've been to a lot of places where like they weren't using source code control, but then they found out that somebody else had a GitLab server, and so now everybody's using GitLab within the place. But they don't have that culture of like, oh, let's share all our repos and be able to clone them. They're all still like, I've got my repo and only my group can see it. And maybe there's some value in like having that, but like if you've got reuse stuff that could be useful, it would make sense to have it open and let everybody. I mean, I guess there's probably some issues with security clearances and stuff. So going back to Fab's presentation, that I could see that presenting some issues.
Obviously.
But yeah.
And then the other thing is that we as Hampelsoft try to use those established workflows when working with our customers. So that's like maybe our smaller scope for HSE. So we we do use Gitflow, for example, and we have workflows in place where we can share code with our customers or where we maybe share our open source libraries with them. And for some of our customers, we work in a way that's very similar to contributing to open source projects because of the way that we have or have not access to their repositories. So that's actually also a thing that we try to learn from the open source world and see how it can make our customer projects, our work with our customers easier.
Well, it's interesting. So Fabiola mentioned the company that had the security concerns, and my immediate thought was I would just use like the open source forking model there and like have, you know, the repository that is the thing that gets deployed to whatever top secret thing you're working on. That is the main repository, and the company keeps control of that. But if you have contractors that have various levels of security clearance, as long as they have clearance to look at that code, you can let them fork it and do their own things and then decide what gets pulled in and run your own whatever checks you have to run before you deploy it. So
yeah, I think Fab did say that looking back and with today's knowledge and with their understanding of what they need, today they would probably go down that route. Back then, the customer thought that they need different requirements. So
it's interesting how times change, because I think I commented to you that like when I started, we were using SVN, and I don't know what your experience with SVN is, but I never really saw anybody successfully branching in SVN. Like it seemed like it was painful, and I worked on a project where it needed some refactoring, so I made a branch and did all the refactoring. It took me like weeks or months, and by the time I was done, it was awesome, and everybody else looked at it, they're like, yeah, that's great, except that we've added all these changes over here, and there's no way that's ever going to get merged back in. And it's like, so I
think I started out different. When I started out doing software, SVN was still everywhere. That must have been 99 maybe. And when I had my first company, when we were still doing web development, we still did use SVN. But it was a different situation because we were all co-located and we were working like stationary on our projects, right? We would go to the office, we would have our SVN server there. Projects tended to be rather smaller. So we were doing the traditional mainline development. And I mean, the concept of branches is only there by name if you think about it. Because technically you don't have branches in Subversion really. You have tags. and you can use that folder and treat it as a branch, but it's not the same thing as in Git.
Exactly, yeah.
So there's a difference. And then pretty soon, I think we moved over to Git. And we didn't run into many problems, but I don't think that we did have a real workflow back then. So it was not all about branching, etc. It was just that the Git tools became more popular and more ubiquitous. So we just went with the times and switched to Git, not so much for any specific technology.
Yeah, we were using SVN, we were doing truck-based development, but it was like more by default because like you said, branching was just not something that people really did. And it actually seemed to work. We had maybe like 8 people at most working on this project, but like it just seemed like nobody was ever really working on the same thing at the same time because all of us were like working on 5 projects at once. So like,
The only thing I remember is creating releases in SVN.
Yeah,
you would have
definitely did that.
What was it? Trunk, tags, and
because it was all folder structure. Yeah, and there was like a release structure. Yeah, and every time you released it, you'd.
So we would do that, but that was it basically.
I think we just did like a feature freeze. Like they would say like, don't make any changes. We're gonna like run these tests and blah blah blah, and then we would like keep iterating. Yeah,
but back then we didn't have the process we have in place right now. I knew much less, of course. I was just starting out, so we winged it most of the times, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think like you and I, like as individual developers, we've learned a lot, but as a community of software developers, like a lot has changed in the past. Although it's weird because in some ways a lot has changed, in some ways not really, because if you read I think you guys mentioned the Dave Farley, Just Humble book, or somebody mentioned that today, and it's like, that book's actually like almost 20 years old or something. So, and when they wrote that from experience. So they've been doing that for 5 or 10 years before that. So the concepts are not necessarily new, but like the way the tooling changes and it makes things easier. And
I think Steve likes to mention that computer science is very old and that like books from the 50s, 60s, 70s are very interesting to read actually.
Yeah.
Because they still hold lots of truth. Back from back in the days when the whole landscape was completely different, right? But the basic principles, it seems, were the same back then.
Well, I read a lot of books around software engineering. A lot of them are like 20 years old and they're still like very applicable. So, but it depends, right? So the books that are written around principles and ideas, right, rather than like the how to do X in C++ or whatever, those books tend to get outdated because better methods come along, and but even like. Functional programming is all the rage now, and object-oriented programming kind of had this rise and fall. But like even that, both of those were actually rather older technologies as well. They've been around for a while. So
yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you see any push to do more functional type programming in Labio, or like?
I have to say honestly that I'm not so deep into these topics, so I can't really speak to that. I gotta say. I mean, I'm not. I'll take that back. Cut that out, please. I'm not stuck with DQMH. We chose DQMH, and we use whatever we have available there. I think what we see is maybe that Labio needs to connect to more and more other systems, maybe languages. So I see that. So of course Python is all the rage, but then again, not so much is actually being done in Python.
Yeah.
But we see C and C++ and Python, of course, and then like the whole IoT thing with where you have MQTT or other protocols, so you can get the data out there. And these things, I think they introduce new paradigms where you see, when talking through MQTT, that's the data structure there, and they have this tag system or whatever. So you can get inspiration from that, right? And if you see, I don't know, if you like for one customer, we need to use gRPC to talk to Python. So I'm exposed to the Python world a little bit. Not that I'm understanding it or programming it, but I get some ideas maybe, or some I see some things that how they do it, and of course, like subconsciously, that might be inspiration to rethink how we do our work in Labio. So I think that's a personal thing. The more that I get exposed to other things, the more experience I have, the more I learn, and the more ideas I get.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm not sure if it's like a question of the times, like the times are changing. That's probably a personal thing.
Yeah, that we're just growing and gaining more experience. So yeah, interesting. So I saw the presentation yesterday on APIs, and it got me thinking. So there's a lot of talk now of like microservices and breaking stuff up, and I'm curious like you mentioned MQTT, has that changed the way you architect systems now? Do you do more smaller things that like communicate in like a microservice type of way through MQTT, or?
Not really, I think.
Okay.
Got to think about what we're doing with MQTT. It's not a very central topic, to be honest. It's a side topic.
Okay.
But it doesn't really change. I mean, the thing that changes is that with MQTT, it makes it easier to connect lots of small systems to your overall system, maybe. But that's not really affecting LabVIEW, I think, in our case at least.
Okay, so you're using that to connect your LabVIEW application to a bunch of other applications, but not necessarily connect multiple little tiny LabVIEW pieces together.
So the way we use it is, for the one customer, we have lots of Arduino-based small acquisition systems, let's put it like that. So they have some sensor readings, temperatures maybe, or simple things. And we collect those things, that data, through MQTT, and then we can display it in a Grafana dashboard, right? And LabVIEW is one of the sources, maybe one with more data coming from LabVIEW. So we, on the dashboard, we don't only want to display those sensors, but also information that's coming from our LabVIEW software. That's why LabVIEW needs to speak MQTT.
So the LabVIEW then talks, so the Arduinos talk to LabVIEW, which then talks to MQTT. Is that the way it works?
No, Arduinos and LabVIEW both talk MQTT to the broker.
Oh, wow. So the Arduinos okay, it's been a while since I played with an Arduino.
It's not true. LabVIEW does, sorry to interrupt you, LabVIEW does also subscribe to the Arduino data, now that I think of it. So it's being visualized in Grafana and logged and processed in LabVIEW.
Oh, cool.
So it's both things.
Cool. So this might be in the weeds and it's not really LabVIEW really, but how does the Arduino talk to the MQTT? Does it have like an Ethernet? I don't remember them having.
Exactly. So you get,
so you have a little
so in this
Ethernet
case,
controller
it's the Arduino, then that's the Ethernet shield, and then we have
Ethernet shield. Yeah, okay, yeah, they make a bunch
then
of
we have a
shields.
customer-specific PCB that the customer designed for the electric current conversion, etc.
Yeah.
So it's a nice little
like
stack.
a little hardware thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I can't remember, they built like 20 or 50 PCBs, so they have them all over the place.
So you see, I know Steve is very bullish on like the Pi things and the Pi Pico and the Raspberry Pi and the Arduinos and stuff. Are you seeing a lot of industry people use those?
No.
Okay.
That's really it started out as a side project. You might have seen that we had this Neopixel project for our user group going, the VLAMP, where we control these.
It's like a little LED thing, right?
Yeah, so the Neopixels are LEDs, and each LED has its own controller, so you can control each LED individually in a stripe. So you can have all sorts of patterns, or like
spell out letters. If you put
have a matrix, together, you can have a spell out letters, etc. So we used that to, first of all, to make the test systems look nice. So, and then the second was to visualize different states. So when the system is booting up, you have like a progress bar that's illuminating the test racks from bottom to top. And when it's finished, then it's at the top. And then it's like pulsating slowly, which is idle. And when the test is running, it's like, I can't remember all the colors. And if there's an error, it flashes red. So that was when we started out with the whole MQTT thing, because that's how we did it. From LabVIEW, we talked through MQTT to the Arduino controlling the Neopixels. That was the first step, really. And then from that, we also then went on and had said, okay, we can have Arduinos taking readings instead of visualizing something.
No, well, I envision that could be very useful, because like if you install Creo, there's no feedback on the Creo, right? You got the like one user LED or something, and that's pretty much it. And so,
people liked it. So one of my first FPGA projects must have been 2008 maybe. It did have a single baud Rio inside, and it talked to DUTs via fiber, right? Okay. And for each, so it had, I think, 2 times 20 in and outputs. And for each in and output, it did have the fiber connector and an LED, so that you could see which one is in use. And I was staying at the customer, and I was sleeping in the hotel for weeks, I think. And in the evenings, I would just play around and make little light patterns, right? So when you plug in the device, that it would like the Knight Rider, it would do left and right, and I don't know, from the center to the edges, etc. And that was by far the thing that got the most attention from the customer. So everybody who walked by would say, "Oh, that's cool. That looks nice. Do it again." And that we were communicating like in the megahertz range and doing all sorts of cool stuff. That was not so fancy.
Yeah.
So that was the first time when I thought, okay, a little light doesn't hurt.
I'm gonna have to start playing with this now. I
Yeah.
gotta learn how to do that. Yeah, but I could see like.
And sorry, it's an open source project, the VLAN, so you can get all the description for the hardware, the source code, etc.
I'm gonna have to get a copy of that.
Yeah.
Cool. No, that's really cool. Yeah, I could see that being useful. Like if you had a bunch of channels and you could have like one LED for each channel, like which ones are in range and out of range, and just like something like a really quick, like walk by or like look at it from the other side of the factory floor and just see like, oh yeah, everything's good. I don't have to like walk over there.
But the one thing is, it's not really the hardware is not industrialized, so it's a kind of a hobbyist solution.
Yeah.
So that might keep people from doing it. But if you have some engineers who have a little wiggle room in what they do, they can totally do that.
Yeah, that seems to be my impression. Is that a lot of people look at the Arduino and the Raspberry Pi and they're like look at it as like, oh, it's a hobbyist.
Yeah.
The one place I saw somebody had a use case for it was they were working with NOAA and they were launching weather balloons and they would lose a balloon. And so like sending up a C-RIO to collect a bunch of data and then lose it, that sounds like a really bad idea. But sending up a $5 Arduino or $10 Raspberry Pi and like collect all the data and have it broadcasted back, and when the balloon disappears, like who cares?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That's cool.
So that's interesting.
But the other thing that we did, we built our own CO2, what do you call it in English? Traffic light, measuring the CO2 content so that you know when to open the windows.
Okay.
So that was also a simple thing. The Arduino, and then a CO2 sensor, and then a small LED stripe. And then we would have a scale on it, right? So it's, all of the LEDs are green, and then the longer you breathe and the longer you don't open the window, the more CO2 you have in your air. And at some point, there are some, of course, in Germany, there are numbers for everything, right?
Oh yeah.
So they tell you when you have to ventilate the room. So if it goes above, I don't know, 1,000 parts per million or whatever, then it flashes red, and then you know you need to open the window. And when the pandemic started out, you know, this was one of the things that people were doing, like measuring the air quality to know when you have to ventilate.
Yeah, I saw there was a lot of little portable CO2 monitors that were getting sold, like little tiny things that you just bring along. Yeah.
And we made a hobby side project out of it, and it's like the Arduino, and then you know, like the breadboard and the cables. So it's kind of looks very technical.
Yeah, no, that's really useful. See, my problem is I own a bunch of Raspberry Pis and Arduinos and stuff, but like just doing a project, I need to be inspired. It needs to be something like practical, like going through one of the tutorials, like, oh, how to flash an LED. Okay, but I do those and that, oh, that's great. But then like, I need to have a real interesting project to try to actually like, go do it. Yeah.
Now I do have some light LEDs in the office, and at the moment they're only pulsating purple. But we've been thinking about ways to connect them maybe to our build servers and in some way visualize how far along the build is maybe. But it's, first of all, there's no time for that and no money. And then we're not really sure how to do that. But I can imagine that our red tools might have an MQTT connector, for example, and just broadcast the status somewhere, and then we could visualize it.
Yeah, so next time we talk, we have to talk about your rat tools. But we're kind of coming up on time. We got about 5 minutes left. So question that I like to ask people is like, can you tell me about a time that you tried something and you thought it was going to work out a certain way and then things didn't work out, and like, what did you learn? Were you able to
let me think.
Something? Yeah, kind of putting you on the spot. So
yeah. So it's not that we have never tried anything that didn't work out. I'm sure of that. But I think I've always taken small steps, so I can't remember any like
nothing
off the top
major.
of my head, nothing major that I could really say this is a huge learning and whatnot.
I'm glad to hear you say the small steps thing though, because that's something that I've been really trying to focus on too lately. Like just takes much smaller steps. Because then, if you fail at a much smaller step, it's super easy. You just throw it away and you go try something else, and it's like it's not a big deal. Yeah.
And I mean, the Agile people know that, right? And I'm not claiming that I've been doing Agile all the time. I'm totally conscious of what I do.
Well, that's a whole can of worms right there too,
But I think I was always cautious running my own business. Like, you have to mitigate the risks. Risk, right? One thing that I can say, which I find interesting, is when I started out with Labio, I learned it from a former colleague of mine. And he had very strict ways to do things, how to align things, and which technologies or techniques to use and which ones not. And when I started out, many of the things that I would suggest or maybe even recommend, I would not do. I would lead wires from the top into structures because then they would align more neatly.
Oh.
Or things like these, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe using the stacked sequence a lot. And the longer I used Labio, the more I came to realize that most of the suggestions of an eye are quite good actually, and I'd rather adhere to them. So maybe that's something that I learned along the years. Maybe listen more closely to people or to instances with more experience, because probably they know what they're talking about,
So
right?
that brings me to a very interesting point, because we're both DQMH Trusted Advisors. So I want to advertise the DQMH Trusted Advisors. What did we just put out? The style guide?
Yeah.
But that brings me to something. So one of the style guide things we kind of went back and forth on between all of us was the get and set VIs and renaming them, or the read and write VIs and renaming them get and set. And that was one of those things where when I started, the guy that I learned from also like the get and set thing, and I was constantly changing them. And then when I stopped working with them, I realized that I was just fighting LabVIEW, right? Like LabVIEW naturally wants to do this, and this is the standard, whether I like it or not. And it's like, I could change it, but then everybody who comes into my project, they're going to see get and set, and it's just kind of weird versus they're used to seeing read and write. So I thought that was an interesting.
It's I'm not totally decided on that one, because what you say is totally true.
Yeah.
I don't like the read and write, but at the same time, I do understand that it's additional effort. Plus, you can't control it really for like other people and other computers. Even if you can set up your own machine to do it automatically, others won't have that. So it's not ideal.
Yeah, it's one of those things too. Like you got to pick your battles, and like which hills are you willing to die on, and which ones are like really important. But
that's true. And it's not that huge of an issue, really. So,
there is a lot of
you can live with both things, right?
Yeah, it is true. I think that's one of the challenges with the style guide is, right, to find the things that are most important and avoid the little nitpicky discussions and,
But I think it already served its purpose, because the one thing is it's a guide, it's a suggestion, right? So you can take it and you can use it or not, or you can use parts of it. And the other thing is we had a very intense discussion about it, right? So now it's really fresh on my mind, and maybe we'll change it or not. And the same for you. Yeah. Maybe you have now a deeper understanding about it. So it already, at least it was a starter for the discussion. So that was good, I think.
So I'll leave you with a thought that I had. I was listening to a podcast recently, and they mentioned the idea of best practices and how they don't like that term because it applies that there is one best practice and it applies everywhere. And their suggestion was to have defaults, the ideas, right?
Okay.
Sensible defaults, right? So like our default is to use GitFlow and do this and do that. But it's the default. It doesn't mean that we have to do that on every project. Yeah. If you have a good reason to deviate, that's fine. Let's document that. And then over time, we can decide, like, as a group, what do we agree is the sensible default way to do things? I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it. I quite like that better than the best practices.
Yeah, that idea resonates a lot. And it's funny because I renamed all the occurrences of best practices to better practices only 2 or 3 months ago.
Cool, yeah.
And of course, Simon Sinek, I want to mention him because I like what he's saying a lot. He's famous for his book Start With Why, right? And one of his books is called The Infinite Game.
Yep.
And what he's saying is being successful or like being happy or whatever it is, it's an infinite game. It's not like you have a game and after 90 minutes there is a target and then you're done, because that's not it. You need to constantly try to I don't know, be successful, be happy, whatever it is that you want to do. So it's an infinite game, and the term best does not fit that, right? Because it's a superlative, and it is not, because it's always like the increment and little steps and becoming a little better. So yeah, I totally don't like best practices anymore. And we go with better practices these days.
Cool, yeah.
But I like the defaults thing as well. It's in the same thing,
defaults, right? Better practices, yeah.
That's cool.
That's a great thought to leave on.
Yes.
So, all right, perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Sam.
That's it for today's episode of the Labio Experiment. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments or questions, head over to thelabioexperiment.com and drop me a note. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @TheLVExperiment so you never miss an episode. And remember, small steps and quick feedback are all you need. Catch you next time. All right. Awesome. No, that went
Cool.
great. I thought that was an awesome conversation. I think we hit a bunch of topics.
Yeah, we can have a few
Although
more. I
We
guess.
do need one more about your rat tool. Actually, are you going to come and present that at our
Yes.
mastermind at some point? Because that kind of slipped my mind. But seeing you,
Yeah, I would like to do that.